Hello, friends. I'd like to tell you a story. This story is about a group of gamers, much like many others. They got together at regular intervals to share stories and experiences, battle hideous monsters, fight against unspeakable evils, and try to save the world while looking good and getting rich and famous. Quite like many another group. This particular group had one member. We'll call him Tom, to protect the guilty. Tom was an outsider, a bit. Sure, Tom always showed up to the game, but Tom played characters that liked to work by themselves. Other members of the group would never consider Tom to be a party leader, just someone who was there all the time and made characters that were good by themselves but didn't play as well with the others. Still, Tom always showed up. So, one night, the group were traveling from one town to another, and they had to camp. During the camp, they all were appropriately cautious and took watches. On the watch that Tom's character was standing guard, he inexplicably turned on his fellow party members, killing them as they slept and taking their goods, all they had of value. He left the bodies and vanished. You can imagine the other players were not amused by this. And you might have had similar experiences in your past. Let me assure you, though, that the subject of today's conversation will not affect you here. For if there's anywhere that you are safe, it is here in the Lair of OmnusI. A new season brought forth by a new year. What new dangers, what new knowledges, what discoveries, and what stories will we uncover? For all of these and more can be found here at the Lair of OmnusI in this, our third season. Welcome, my friends, to another episode of the Lair of OmnusI, another level to be unearthed. Today we're going to be talking about something that's a bit controversial, not in that that this happening is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, just how to deal with these situations when they come up, because they sometimes do. We're going to talk about the adversarial player in this game and how to appropriately deal with adversarial players, what they look like, how they act, etc., etc. And by the time we're done, hopefully, we might even be able to find some good uses for adversarial players. Now, in this, we're not talking about controversial characters. We're not talking about people who abusively predate upon the fellow players or do things that annoy or irk those other players. No, here we're talking about people who deliberately set out to make a character that stands against what the rest of the party is doing. And while that may seem terrible, I think you'll find as we go on that this kind of thing might actually spice up a game and make it interesting. And if it can't, or if it's not intended and breaks the conventions of the game, how to deal with it appropriately. So, I hope you're ready for a rather difficult level, but one that I think is very appropriate. Adversarial players in gaming. If you've been around the gaming sphere for any length of time, you'll probably have heard a story or two about some player who set out to ruin the fun of everybody else at the table. Something about our hobby tends to draw in a lot of people, and some of them are somewhat misanthropic. They just don't like other people to be happy more so than they are themselves, and will work at ruining what other people have, enjoyment in. Now, this kind of person is relatively rare, and you may never have gamed with this kind of person. But if you do, there are some ways of dealing with such a situation. Now, first of all, let's look at something on a little bit of the lighter side. Sometimes a game master will think that their group is just a little too flat. Everybody's a chum of everybody else. The group works together seamlessly to overcome problems, and there never seems to be any kind of banter or strife among the group. A game master who does that might want to set things up in a campaign so that the players occasionally are set off against each other. This can often be done in the beginning of a campaign with your session 0, if the game master drops tidbits of dissent among the group. For instance, giving each person a secret goal that might work contrary to the goals of other player characters. Or possibly having them come from different backgrounds that seem like they are incongruous. Somebody who is a lawman pitted against the same side as somebody who is a criminal by deed, if not always intent, perhaps. Or somebody who comes from an outside nation that is known to be hostile and distrustworthy. Well, these kind of backgrounds may, with good role play, actually serve to create a bit of tension, a bit of drama. Although it is refreshing when that can get turned on its ear. The discordancy is redeemed in and of itself by understanding where the other person is coming from. If it's just a background element and that person can change or was labeled with a brush they never properly deserved, that can be a form of character development. Oftentimes, that's one of those things that players strive to overcome as an initial bad background or some sort of misunderstanding that has always painted them with a black brush. But in this case, you can use that to set players initially at dis-ease with each other and eventually grow to trust each other with their lives. And that's possibly one of the most harmless elements of setting up adversarial situations among your players. If they automatically don't get to trust each other and they start off with that and they can role play it out, you can set up some interesting dramatic conflict. For instance, if you've ever read the Chronicle series of Dragonlance, you see some very good party banter, but you also see layers of mistrust, different characters that don't just automatically embrace their fellow characters. For instance, Sturm the Knight and Raistlin the Wizard don't see eye to eye in a lot of things. Sturm doesn't think the wizard is honorable, and the wizard thinks that the knight is pompous and full of himself. Lacking a sort of practicality that's sometimes necessary. You have Riverwind the Barbarian, who is an outsider to civilization, and it takes him quite a while before he trusts any of the others, especially throwing the racial prejudices of his people at Tanis Half-Elven, a half-elf and therefore a challenge for Riverwind to overcome with his mistrust of things that are outside of his experience. So he's a challenging character, but eventually becomes one of the companions in the story. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Setting players off with some bits of discordancy can create interesting story elements of themselves. Game Masters have been doing it for a very long time, especially, again, if you're tired of the seamless hegemony existing between the players. So background adversarial situations can certainly be interesting. Another opportunity at the beginning of a campaign that a game master might have is secretly setting up one of the player characters to be a major nemesis in the story. Now there's some problems with this, some very deep problems with the wrong group. There's a sort of convention in a lot of groups that everybody is on the same side and working together towards the same goal. Throwing something that wrenches at that dynamic can really cause problems if the group isn't committed to the storytelling, but is more committed to overcoming the obstacles and completing the story together in a particular way. if you throw that wrench in that one of the players can't be trusted, you're doing two things. Number one, you're really trusting that player to be able to play out that role, working towards their alternate goal, but not giving the game away. Sure, you can drop some hints in there that not all is as they wish it was, and you may occasionally have events pop up that only somebody on the inside would know about. But making sure that that tracks through the entire story is difficult, especially if you don't want to give the game away too early. Especially in a game where you have elements where magical divination is possible. If you can just ask your patron, hey, somebody in my group a traitor? And they hear, yes. Well, you may have just destroyed the party's unity. Although, in those circumstances, it would be very interesting. It'd take a real mastermind player to be able to thread their story through enough that they're not the one who's doubted. The other difficulty that you have with doing that kind of a storyline, outside of leaning heavily on the player, is you really might have some long-term problems with trust after you do something like this. Sure, some groups are mature enough that they'll say, oh, well, that was just an element of the story. We explored it. It was interesting. Now we're going to move on. Some people don't let that go very easily, and they have a hard time then trusting people. They see shadows everywhere. And while sometimes being realistically suspicious, possibly even paranoid to a certain functional degree, might be entertaining as a story element or as a character element, it can get tedious if you're always looking over your shoulder. It also can be really galling if it's only subtle in the game and the players have an idea that somebody is working against the group. Then your hackles are going to be raised against that player whenever they do something, always wondering, how is this working against you? One of the very first times I played a particular role-playing game, I was only briefly told about. This is OmnusI as a player, mind you. One of the players was quite experienced with the storyline and made an adversarial character in such a way that, looking back on it, my character probably would have, if I had been more experienced with the storyline, been able to pick out his shenanigans several times over the course of the storyline, but I just didn't, and I tried to stick with that general convention that we're all working together for the same cause. And that blew up spectacularly in the case of that campaign, but it really did kind of lead a sense of unease whenever I played. I didn't want to fight with this particular other player, but things just kept seeming to draw to that. But just as it would crest to the point where a confrontation seemed inevitable, it would de-escalate to some extent. The crisis would abate, and we would just move on to having to work on mutual survival in many cases. So, all in all, it was somewhat unsatisfying, but it did help to drive the story forward. My character, who was the good guy, trademark, drove the story by continuing to try to go out and help people. This other character worked to sow discord as we went, so it was interesting. But it did, interestingly enough, create a dynamic that kept the story moving. When I eventually got tired of this, looked back and realized the rest of the characters were fairly morally ambiguous, and retired my character, taking a morally ambiguous character to play, the game disintegrated for lack of direction. So, something to be aware of there. Now, that kind of circumstance, with the game master being completely on board with the person creating a character that will work in alternate ways to the goals of the group, sometimes completely working against them, can create a moment where the whole thing is revealed and aha! That character is suddenly revealed as having been a double agent the entire time. How you go forward from that moment depends largely on the group, how you've portrayed things, and what the ultimate goal is. Is that character a triple agent, working both sides against the other until the end so he can guarantee that the big bad evil guy is going to lose because he knows his weakness, he knows the thing that he absolutely dreads. Is that the situation that will redeem the entire thing in the rest of the player's eyes and turn it into a successful conclusion? Does the party lose because of that player's true allegiance? If that's the case, be ready for some pretty hard feelings afterward. If that player turning means the other group gets stabbed in the back and vanquished, then hopefully the Game Master has some sort of a backup plan to get the storyline going so that the majority of the players are not completely and utterly crushed. If that happens, and I have seen that once or twice, where one player can undo everything at the worst possible time and completely sink the campaign, well, that's going to be a bad ending more often than not. And it takes a certain kind of player to look at that situation and get excited and talk about, oh, wasn't that great how that player did that, and everything just kind of came to a head. We should have seen it, but we didn't. Those kind of circumstances are incredibly rare, and most players get invested in their characters to the point they don't want to see something like that happen. So do that at your own peril. Now, an adversarial player, not just the character, is a lot greater of a challenge, much bigger, because you have a person who deliberately goes out of their way to work against the group. Maybe not as their basic character. For instance, you might think a person back in the old days of playing a paladin with their lawful good and paragons of righteousness would be this sort of player. But quite honestly, a person who had a character like that, who paladins were quite powerful, could often work against the designs of their fellow players, while under the veneer of being the good guys. For instance, if anybody else had a particular style that they were looking at playing, even if it was the way the majority of other players were looking. For instance, if the others were morally ambiguous, I'm using that term a lot today, and they liked using poison or stealing from others in maybe a Robin Hood sort of way, or maybe not. The person playing the paladin is now working against the group, even though they are the agent on the side of law and order and goodness. If they are going to be unflexible and always insist the rest of the group play their way, that's going to create discord and problems as well. So it doesn't have to just be that somebody is a backstabbing dirtbag in order to be this type of character. It just means they're playing a character that does not fit with other people and will work against letting the other people play the way that they choose to play. Now again, you may have conventions in your game that allow this, but in my experience, most games that you play, there's more than enough adversarial pressure on the outside to afford to have people that you can't trust in your personal group. Imagine playing a game of Shadowrun, a world of deceit, violence, treachery. Your tight-knit crew is tasked to go and do a Shadowrun. Something that's high risk, high reward. You are penetrating into a corporate stronghold, and all of a sudden all the alarms sound, even though you did everything right. And security goons just pile on you. That can be a game over scenario very quickly. How much worse is that when one of the players is roundly congratulated by the chief of security and walked out of the room? That's going to be awkward, to say the least. To explain something like that in a way that will not ruin the group's dynamic can be challenging. Of course, in the case of Shadowrun, you could always say, for instance, they were chipped in with an alternate personality that led them to do this. That's certainly within the bounds of what corporate skullduggery would do. Maybe they were possessed by some sort of overriding spirit. Again, Shadowrun, that's possible. So there are means that you can salvage a situation like that, but generally, the outside force, if you're a game master and you've put up something that's worth worrying about, worth caring enough for your characters to drive to the lifestyle that they are, it's awfully hard to do that and not feel that you can ultimately trust the people who are around you. That kind of thing that destroying trust in your group makes it very hard to justify even an adventuring lifestyle. If you can't trust the companions around you that it's you against a living and challenging danger, well, it's going to be awfully hard to play with that person again in that capacity and trust them again. Now, there are some games that really do enjoy those kind of scenarios where you can't necessarily trust everyone. I'm thinking primarily, right now at least, of Blades in the Dark. Blades in the Dark is a game where everybody is playing a criminal. You're trying to set up a criminal enterprise in a pseudo steampunk with magic kind of Victorian city. Outside is horrors unimagined, so you're stuck in the city. And you're trying to gain influence and power in the criminal underworld, a place where you often can't trust anybody. In a situation like that, well, those conventions become very important. If you feel like you can trust the other people in your group, then you will at least have something to put your back to in a world where that can't be taken for granted. You will eventually, over time, form bonds that approach friendship, if not trust and respect. But sometimes, if you play with that dynamic a little bit too much, it can be awfully hard to form a crew when you have division and strife. Banter is one thing, but absolutely being at each other's throats makes for a difficult game, one that some people might not really enjoy coming to, session in, session out. But how to turn that to your advantage? Again, identifying a player who is a problem can be fairly simple. It's the person who's always working in a way that the other group is not in on, or who always seems to have secrets that the rest of the group isn't in on. Those type of people often get kind of sheltered off to an outsider role. Again, they aren't giving you information, then you don't necessarily have to give them information, and the party will do things without that person that they can't feel that they can trust. Usually it's the formative adventures than a group over the course of a campaign that really bonds them together and makes them understand the strengths and weaknesses of other characters so that they can game plan, so that they can form those kind of bonds, those kind of relationships. If a player is relentless at destroying those bonds or preventing them from ever forming, they can be awfully tedious to have in a group. You don't know where you stand with a person like that. And when you're risking your life, when you're plunging into dangerous dungeons where you need everybody to work together, it can be fairly difficult. However, there are some strategies that you can use for the adversarial player that, again, in a situation where you're starved for other people and perhaps you even like the idea of an outside perspective in a group, you can use that person in certain ways that can still basically free your group up to explore other avenues of role play. The first one, of course, is to allow them to play a loner character. For instance, if they want to play a scout. Well, as long as they always report back when there's danger and they don't blatantly steal from the party, having somebody who prefers to work solo isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can allow them to indulge their loner personalities and still at the same time work along with the group. You can also, in a situation like that, understand that synergizing with a person like that isn't necessarily about bringing them in and necessarily stacking your abilities. It's a matter of allowing them the opportunity to roam about and see things from their own perspective that you might not have considered. So a person playing, say, in a fantasy game, a ranger or thief type, might be able to poke into crannies that the rest of the group are either too honorable or just don't normally go to that idea of how to pursue their objectives. And if that's the case, then, again, new vistas might be open to your group. Now, it may be inconvenient, certainly, if they work in a way that's kind of somewhat discordant to the rest of the nature of the group, then you're going to have to find ways to deal with that. And again, a person who is a thief, well, if you could just roll your eyes, smile, and go, oh, yeah, thief's gonna thief, or the person who is always out insisting to be outside of town and in their own little encampment while the rest of the group is enjoying a nice night in town, well, in that case, you could just pity the player for leaving themselves out of what is otherwise a good time, and maybe they'll change their ways when the exciting things happen in town while they're camped outside. and miss out on a good fight or a bit of useful events that they have to then have explained to them so that they can make it in with their characters. You can always try to hold out an open hand and allow them to come in when it's time. But if they relentlessly refuse to, then you can sometimes just acknowledge that they're different, that they enjoy different things, and not force them to necessarily be in with the group. In this case, that would be holding them out at arm's length, which is where they seem to want to be. But that's more of a loner character, more so than somebody who's actively working against the group. It's just recognizing that somebody has different needs and motivations, and that's not necessarily adversarial. Sometimes it's just the way a person is wired. They might change someday, but for the time being, again, holding them at arm's length and allowing them to be part of the group in decisions and discussions when they want to can work. Especially if you don't have a very deep player pool to draw from and you kind of need another person to round out a group. That does sometimes happen, and you can work that way. Just lavish more of the attention on the players who do want the spotlight and who do want to do things. And if that person, for instance, we'll use an example. If you're playing in a world, I believe it's called, there's a game called N-Cream, where the entire world is covered with a viscous black sludge, and one person wants to play a character who wants to build a submarine to explore the sludge sea, and all the other players have the story going on. That player wants to do that thing, just let them resolve what they're doing with a few dice rolls and go with it. Okay, well, you found some parts and you're working on your submarine. All right, now, the rest of you, this is all happening. And if that person complains, it's like, look, it's going to take you a long time to work on your sludge submarine. So while they're doing things that take much less time, you're going to isolate yourself and work on the submarine continuously. So that's what you're choosing to do. So no, it's not about going off and exploring the sludge sea. At this point, you're still working on your submarine. That can work. But when it comes to real adversarial things, a game master can often be at their wit's end, looking at players who just deliberately want to take advantage of the other players, to cause harm, to cause discord. Now, again, I've talked about convention, these rules that we have for the game that we play. Some of them are somewhat inviolate. If you break these laws, these unwritten codes, you can be shunned from the group, asked not to come back, and most would see that as justified. Working against the party borders on that. Attacking the party, that crosses a line more often than not. Now, I have a rule in my group that if the entire group votes one person off the island, I'm sorry, you're done. The other group has deemed that you can't play well with them, and much as I might enjoy having you at the table, the group has spoken. Now, if you have a character and you, say, perform the way that my opening story did, where you draw your dagger and knife everybody while they're sleeping, take their things. Generally, if I allowed that to stand, everybody's going to have a bad time except for the person who won one over on everyone and thought they had succeeded. I find that to be rather detestable because, again, you're coming together as a group, and if one person takes it in their own mind to do this and thinks they're going to walk away with it, no. I know some DMs will stick to their world, and some game masters say that everything that happens, happens, and they might allow somebody to do that. But in my world, no. The moment you draw steel against your allies, one of the divinities who watches over heroes and adventurers looks at that and goes, no, you have a massive heart attack before you even have a chance to strike out. So don't even bother rolling, you pitch over dead. On top of the person you were going to knife, so when you die, you wake them up so they're not left sleeping while your watch is going on. Or if you just die sitting over in your little corner as you contemplate pulling out your knife and stabbing everybody, he just watches over the group so nothing else happens until somebody wakes up and finds out that you died in your sleep or during watch. And that person is generally then explained the rules very carefully in a way that they can't fail to grasp. If it's, say, an adventure path from 5th edition D&D, there's no room in those for a person to be a double agent in most of the circumstances. If somebody turns out to be a double agent in those, there are a number of crisis points where they can turn and everything can be completely obliterated by one person turning, especially if they make a character that's on the extremes, like any wizard or somebody who is the front center tank. If they step aside and let all the monsters through, your whole game can be ruined just at the whim of one person. So those kind of players really do occasionally violate a deep trust among players, that everybody is there to have a good time, everybody is there to tell a story, and if you ruin the story by, an act of betrayal that seems pointless or, well, again, you as a group are going to have to decide what to do with that person. If it is something that you can salvage, rather than by fiat, well, feel free. In my circumstance, I've been fairly unilateral in that if I have a group of strangers and one person says, I'm going to kill everybody and take their money, no, you don't. Your character dies of a massive heart attack as you're contemplating that, and the others are going to wake up and you're going to be dead there. They're going to roll your body, and you can just go. You don't want to play with the group, you can go. But again, the adversarial player usually does these things for a reason. And sometimes understanding the reason can be crucial in finding out how to deal with that player too. If there's some sort of personal umbrage between players, that's something that should be worked out outside of the game table. If it impacts the game, there's a problem. And that kind of disharmony, especially when there's no reason for it in character, is something to be avoided whenever possible. If you have rather messy friendship breakups, they can ruin groups if left unchecked. So it's really important to keep an eye on your players sometimes and do little mental health checks on those kind of relationships and just generally how people are fitting in with the whole group. If there are problems, communication is key. I've said that before. But really, it is true. Understanding why somebody would work against the group, if it's not because of a plot, if it's not because of something that's in their character, oftentimes it's because of something rather drastic going on with that player. And if they're just trying to just burn everything, then that's sometimes a cry for help. And if you are, a compassionate person at all, you should probably take a look at that and see what you can do to help them or see them get help. Something of that nature. But if it's just somebody who just likes working against everybody else, if there's a person who really has a reputation for not being able to play with others, or who always likes ruining other people's fun, sorry, as a group, you've got some difficult decisions ahead of you. Or maybe not. Maybe if this person is just so notorious that you don't want them in your group at all. Maybe they've done something so heinous that can't be forgiven, and that person has to leave the group. In that case, I wish you luck, because those things often can get messy, especially in a small community where everybody knows each other. That can get kind of harmful. If you're in a large group with a large pool of players around, maybe that's not such a big deal. I would say this, however. In any circumstance where you're taking on a new player and you don't know if they're an adversarial player or not, have some sort of a vetting period, some sort of probation, so that you can get a grasp on how they're going to play with your group, how they'll fit in. And if somebody just can't work well with the rest of the group, well, it may be time to just tell them, okay, well, at the end of your probation, you just aren't a member of this group. It's usually the easiest way for everybody. But adversarial players, they do exist, and maybe you'll have one. Maybe you already have one. Maybe you're really having a hard time coming to grips with somebody who is working against other players. My general advice, as I have just elaborated over, understand them, see if you can turn those tendencies to something that can be useful, that can be positive towards the group. And if you can't, it may be time to either have a hard talk or let that player go. Maybe to find another group that will accept their desire to work against the other people that they come to the table with. Trust is a difficult thing to knit back after it's been shattered. You can wound trust, you can push the boundaries of trust, but once it's completely broken, and the players know that this person broke that trust, well, that can echo through campaign after campaign after campaign after that. So, something to play with at your discretion, but at your peril, potentially. So, now that you've enjoyed that, shall we get on to a little bit of treasure? For Halloween this year, my local grocery store had a sale on mini pumpkins. So I bought a bundle of them, and my family and I got to painting them. Not carving. Smaller pumpkins like this, you can often lose a lot of detail unless you're quite good, and none of us are. I don't know if that my wife has ever carved a pumpkin, and I should have let my son carve one. Next year, definitely. But, so we painted the pumpkins. And it occurred to me that this is really kind of honoring a tradition that goes back a long, long ways. You know, harvest rituals combined with, you know, the different facets of different religions or cultures and so on and so forth. And we all painted ours differently. My wife painted a portrait of herself on hers. And my son, who is currently playing Orc in his role-playing game, made one that's proper orky, drawing a big orc skull face on his and wah on the backside. Me, I went with more of the, you know, typical, somewhat scary face. Not very scary. But it occurred to me that something like this is actually a pretty good platform for one of the kind of magical items that I really enjoy the most. And that is something that is flexible and able to be something that the party can use with a bit of creativity. And having a wide variety of different effects and possibilities, so that when they're combined in the right manner, you can create some very interesting effects. At one point, for instance, I gave every member of the party a small jar of Play-Doh. And I said, this is it was a Christmas present. If you make something out of this Play-Doh, your character will have that in the game. If you need a sword, for instance, you can make a little sword, roll your Play-Doh and put a little cross piece on it. It's like, I have a sword. I'm like, okay, you have a sword. Cool. Or I could really use a ladder in this situation. So you just roll out 2 long pieces and roll out another long one and cut into pieces and make lattice, the rungs for it. And you have a ladder. Good job, you. Now, none of them did anything with that, which I'm kind of sad about. They never did. That's kind of how my group goes sometimes, giving them something they just don't think about how to use things differently. But I thought it was kind of a cool idea. And, you know, I'm drawn to items like, you know, the robe of many items or robe of useful items that have a wide range of different uses, even if they're not individually very, very powerful. Used in the right circumstance, they can be overwhelmingly useful. So, in terms of your treasure, I think I'm going to give to you a blank canvas item of a pumpkin, about this size. Could fit in the hand quite comfortably. And a set of pigments and a brush. Your character will have this. And if you decide to eat the pumpkin, some people like pumpkin. Go for it. It's even a special pumpkin that tastes like pumpkin spice. Enjoy. But when you draw on the pumpkin with the pigments using the brush, you can do some fun things with it. The visage that you draw may have a magical effect. Or maybe you could try something else. I don't know. Well, I do know, but you don't know. So, if you ever play with me, remind me that you have this pumpkin and those pigments, and that you want to try something. And we'll see together what you come up with. I really do like items that let the players indulge their creativity and inspire them to do something outside of the box. Something outside of the list of abilities they have on their character sheet. So, you have one such item, with probably more clarity than I usually give these kind of items. So, you're very welcome to it. In addition, you can also have 8 lair points for today. Keep track of those on your character sheet, and when next we meet, we can actually discuss how you can play and use those. So, thank you for joining me. I am never your adversary, but I'm always on your side, here to help you through the world of gaming. I am OmnusI, and until next time, I hope that you stay healthy, that you stay happy and sane, and that you always have some sort of game to look forward to in the very near future. Thank you, and farewell.